Welcome to Deadly Days, Tales of Dark Fantasy. I'm your host, Joe Bandel. These are stories I have translated and I'm offering in English for the first time. This particular story is The Shadow Player by Karl Hans Strobl, and it's in Lemuria Book 2, the second volume of stories that I uh, have on my bookstore at bandelbooks.com. So if you're interested, this is a fairly long story again, so I think I'm going to just dive right into it. The Shadow Player. It was on November 21, 1759, in the Battle of Meran, when the Prussian resistance began to weaken and the Austrian leaders were waiting for the surrender of General Fink. And it was one of the last Prussian cannonballs in this battle that tore off the right leg of the colonel of the Austrian regiment Lassie, Martin Johann Baron von Letrowski. When the colonel woke up from his unconsciousness in the field hospital, the surgeon showed him his leg, which still had the riding boot on it. And it was a very strange feeling for him to see one part of his body so separated from another. Then he learned that General Fink had surrendered with his regiments, and with a deep sigh, the colonel fell back on his mattress, from which he had tried to get up in the momentary oblivion of his wound. After his processing, the Baron received a general retirement, but he went to Vienna, reported for an audience with his empress, and put the retirement papers in her hands. Majesty, he said, in this war, whole men are needed. I am only half a man, and every hour would remind me that I lack something to serve your Majesty as I would like. But if your Majesty has a place somewhere in the civil service, I would dare to fill it. It is only in this way that I might withdraw from the field of battle. The Empress laughed and promised the Baron to see where she could find something for such a deserving man. And some time later the colonel received an appointment as an imperial judge in the capital of a province. The office of emperor's judge had once had its great importance, but now it had lost more and more of its functions to other offices, and it had not remained much more than a kind of supervision of certain branches of administration and justice. Nevertheless, this office gave its holder the opportunity to do good, and Baron von Letrowski did not miss any of these opportunities. At the same time, he had enough time to live his inclinations. If there was something that the Baron had missed in his soldiering, it was the occupation with the earth. It gave him immense pleasure to see how things grew and ripened in the fields, and often when he passed by germinating seeds with his regiment, he slowed down and finally stopped completely to lose himself in the sight of the growing seed. Often an unsoldierly regret came over him when the hard necessity of war forced him to destroy the fields. After his wounding, he would have preferred to retreat to one of his country estates and devote himself to cultivating his fields and tending his forest. But these wishes had to remain silent, for his empress was in need, and it was his duty to serve her, if no longer in the field, then elsewhere, where he could be of some use to her. Not wanting to give up his favorite occupation, he bought an extensive garden near the city and spent all his free time turning this rather unkempt piece of land into a little paradise. With much taste, he knew how to unite the French style with the English style in this garden, and the alternation between representative dignity and graceful lightness was expressed to perfection in its layout. The bachelor spent most of his evenings with the friendly family of Count Zerotin. The wife of the house was an excellent chess player and thus accommodated the other inclination of the Baron, a predilection for this game, which was almost as great as that for horticulture. In the family of Count Zerotin, the council also got acquainted with a poor noblewoman who spent half her time raising an orphan and half as a governess for the children. When the housewife was prevented by other duties, Miss Sophie took her place at the chessboard, and the colonel did not hesitate to assure her that she was almost as knowledgeable about the game as the countess herself. But the woman won the baron's favor when, during a visit with the count's family to his park, she openly showed her delight in the wonders of his empire, and when encouraged by the owner, she pointed out the remarkable things in a few but accurate and well put words, and expressed her appreciation of the fine taste of the creator. The baron took her hand and asked her if she did not wish to command this garden. Sophie was so frightened and in her trembling astonishment that Latrowski was almost no less bewildered in front of her than she was in front of him. 2 weeks later, the city heard about the engagement of the emperor's judge to the young lady, and they were more than a little surprised because the lord of the manor was already almost 60 years old and was a confirmed bachelor. Sophie, however, was very young, barely 18 years old, and the unequal couple was considered a failure. There were more than a few voices that predicted that this marriage would not go well. But the prophets were wrong, because nothing of marital conflicts came to the public. The baron continued his previous life of seclusion, and his young wife showed no inclination to move in high society. They spent their time tending the garden and playing chess, preferring the former in summer and the latter in winter. After the marriage had lasted a year, the baron began to build in his garden. It was to be a fun pavilion, a charming, cozy home for the young woman, because she seemed to be a little sad. The little house that rose at the end of the garden was the delight of all who saw it. Surmounted by a roof broken in its lines, it turned its main front towards the garden, which rose in front of it to a terrace. The central part of the building bulged forward a little, and the side wings, which at first receded, then swept back, so that the whole was given a graceful cheerfulness. The cornices of the windows were decorated with stone garlands, from which hung clusters of fruit, and over the door was placed the coat of arms of the Baron of Latrowski, a silver pole in a red field. Inside there were several rooms furnished with all comfort, and the most remarkable of which was the middle one. It had so many corners that it could almost be called round, and all the walls, from the floor to the ceiling, were embroidered with landscapes from distant lands. Mighty palm tree trunks formed the foreground, painted so vividly that one could really believe oneself in a forest. The wide panels, which had been given the strangest shapes by the painter's imagination, united on the ceiling to form a dense screen. And if you turned your eyes to the two windows, the light that came in through the glass panes really seemed to be dusk in a palm grove. But between the scaly tree trunks, one looked out on the landscapes lying in the bright sunshine. There was the Sphinx of Giza and the pyramids. There was Jerusalem, seen from the Mount of Olives, the vast South American steppe, at the edge of which the Andes rose in the blue distance. The Sahara was with an endless procession of camels, over their heads the deceptive mirage of the Fata Morgan, while in the foreground lay the bleached skeletons of animals and humans. This palm room soon became the young woman's favorite place to stay. But even now, the success expected by her husband did not materialize. She did not become more cheerful. One day, the emperor's judge once again inspected the stockade. From time to time, he had to check whether everything was in order, whether the prisoners were sufficiently well kept, and whether they were being treated according to the rules. Just as he had finished his inspection and was respectfully escorted to the gate by the officials, a newly arrived prisoner was to be brought to the provost. "Wait," said the provost briefly, for he felt that, after all, it was well to remove his superior first before proceeding to official business. But the imperial judge insisted that the man be taken in at once in his presence, and so the provost began to make the entry in his book, while the prisoner was examined by two guards to see if he had anything on him that was not allowed to keep according to the regulations. The new prisoner was a young man with lofty dark eyes and hair of the same brown color. A straight nose and a bold mouth gave the face a harmonious perfection. An attractive openness spoke of his manner and from his answers. Without being insolent, he presented himself with complete impartiality, and it seemed as if he felt inwardly superior to all those people who had instant power over him. His name was Anton Kuhnel, and he was a shadow player by his trade. "Shadow player?" asked the emperor's judge. "What kind of a trade is that?" "A free art," Anton Kuhnel replied, "to present to a laudable public all that has taken place since the creation of the world." "There you probably say a bit too much. And where are your stage and your actors?" "Here are my actors." The lad raised two slender hands of the most beautiful construction. Narrow fingers, which showed their flexibility, spread before the eyes of the baron. "And my stage?" "Any white wall is my stage." He had immediately determined that the man who spoke to him was a higher official, and with the instinct of a free spirit, he felt that it was not impossible to win his favor. So he throws shadow figures on the wall, a rare art if it is done well. "And why is he here?" The baron asked the provost to hand him the passport of the boy, and from it he saw that the shadow player had to serve 3 days for vagrancy. While waiting for the baron's attention, Kuhnel had hoped that the punishment could be waived by a word of power from the governor, and now he dared it to ask, "If your grace would be kind enough to give me—" "No, my dear, you will have to hum for 3 days. Nothing will help you." The provost and the guards laughed in the feeling of power. "But," continued the baron, "when he has done his time, he can at least come to me and give me a sample of his art." And after giving the order to the provost to bring the man to his garden pavilion after his punishment, the emperor's judge left the prison. He was quite satisfied with the coincidence that the shadow player had brought him. He had been looking for a distraction for Sophie for a long time, and order to counteract what seemed to him to be an ever-increasing change in her mind. Sophie received his news with seeming indifference, but the man laughed to himself. He wanted to make sure that the artist's performances were quite fine and varied, and his wife's laughter would give him courage to face life. Kuhnel was brought by the provost himself after 3 days. The baron immediately brought him before his wife. This is the man, he said, who is able to perform everything that has happened since the creation of the world. But has he not forgotten his actors? He laughed. The lad raised his hands again as he had done then, and when the young woman looked up at the same moment, their eyes met. She looked him in the eyes with a quiet astonishment, and then turned back to the fine embroidery that lay on her lap. She had looked forward to the visit without any particular expectation. She had felt the whim of her husband as she complied with all his wishes and regulations, without joy, and often even with the quiet reluctance concealed from herself. Now, torn from her equanimity by this one look from the stranger, she felt an agonizing helplessness. She felt as if a strong hand had taken her from her ground, and she did not know when she would regain her composure. In the stranger's gaze, she had read a wild and enthusiastic admiration, and at the same time a desire that blazed in flames around her. The Baron had already had one of the rooms in the left wing of the pavilion arranged for the performance of the shadow player. From the one wall that offered the greatest flat surface to the play, all furniture had been removed, and when he now led Anton Kuhnel into this room, the latter expressed his satisfaction with this stage, but he asked that he be allowed to make a few more preparations. And then, after dark, he would perform his art for his highly favored audience, to what he hoped would be great satisfaction. With a smile at the man's phrases, the Baron left him, having ordered the servants to do his bidding. In the palm room, his wife's embroidery lay on the chair. She herself was no longer there, and the Baron went out into the park to look for her. Between two high Taurus walls in the French part of the garden, he found her, in front of a marble grouping depicting Cupid and Psyche. The group was standing deep in a niche cut into the wall, the young, slender bodies in tender and yet delicate contact, as if the two were hiding here to avoid being seen by uninvited eyes. "How do you like our guest?" he asked, quietly, putting his arm in hers and taking his cane in the other hand. Sophie turned reluctantly. "You know that I am content in our solitude. Have I ever longed for a more pleasurable experience than that offered by the garden and the chess game? And now you bring a fairground performer into our house. I think he still has the manner of the folk and the stench of the people he was with for 3 days." The Baron looked at his wife in amazement. He had never known her to have such an outburst, and had never known that her pride and nobility was so strong. Apologizing, he said, "I thought I was amusing you with such a demonstration," and supported on her arm and on his cane, hobbling along beside her, he added soothingly, "We can send him away right away if that is what you want. I'll give him some money and chase him out. He won't cause your displeasure." But almost more vehemently than before, Sophie said, "No, no, you can't do that. He is already in the house. We can't chase him out right away. Poor man. He has his artistic ambitions. Now he'll have to stay. At least we will dismiss him right after the show." Sophie made no reply. They walked on a narrow path over a beautiful soft lawn in the English part of the park. The path was just wide enough for the two of them to walk side by side. With the coming of dusk, a mist fell, which became thicker and thicker, clinging to the branches of the trees. Slowly the white layer sank onto the meadow, and Sophie, who was beginning to feel chilled, pulled her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders. When the Baron noticed this, he also put his coat around her as if to protect her. But this made his limping stronger, and for the first time Sophie felt with unpleasant clarity that her husband was a cripple. On the main path that ran straight through the park, one of the servants was waiting with the message that Kuhnel was ready for the presentation. In the room set aside for the performance, the shadow player received his guests with a deep bow and then escorted them to the armchairs provided for them. A large number of candles, whose light was united by a reflector placed behind them, were placed on a table. In front of the light source, a cloth was stretched across the room, and by its shadow divided the wall into two parts. After Anton Kuhnel had placed the Baron and his wife in the chairs in such a way that they turned their backs to the light source and the cloth, he bowed again, first to Sophie and then to the imperial judge. "My stage," he said, pointing to the light part of the wall. Then he crawled away under the cloth and the performance began. "The creation of the world," said the shadow player. Something monstrous, shapeless, rose over the edge of the shadow into the light of the stage, like a pillar of smoke, which covered a figure, wandered back and forth, and finally stopped, and it seemed to spin around itself. Then an enormous arm stretched out of it and described a commanding gesture toward the stage. And immediately the ground came alive at the feet of the figure. Clods of earth seemed to clump together, grow, rise up, and opening themselves, give birth to animals of all kinds: lions, horses, lambs, camels, peacocks, crocodiles, elephants. More and more creatures were called forth from the fertile ground of the shadow. Finally, the towering figure disappeared, and the stage was empty again. "Very good," the Baron praised, and leaned forward to read on his young wife's face what effect the lad's art were having on her. But Sophie sat without a sign of interest and looked straight ahead toward the wall. Anton Kuhnel announced the second act. Adam and Eve. It was the creation of the first human beings, the life in paradise, the sin of the fall, and the expulsion, all depicted by two skillful hands, using as decorations a few palm trees and animals that Kuhnel had quickly cut out of paper. He had not been kidding when he said that he could show everything that had happened since the creation of the world. It really seemed as if all the stories since the beginning of time could gain shape through his shapes, simplified to the utmost, and yet true in all characteristics. The shadows of the strangest events passed over the stage. The most important things were expressed in sharp, clear outlines, and Kuhnel did his best when he had to juxtapose two people in a significant scene. Then his hands really seemed to do wonders. His dexterity came into its own, and the more the Baron watched, the more he marveled at the lad's skill. Sophie did not seem charmed in the same way. While the Baron did not stop with his praise, she would sit quietly and keep looking toward the stage, as if already waiting for the next act. Anton Kuhnel also presented the flood and Noah's Ark, followed by the story of Jacob and his brothers, and after presenting Daniel in the pit, he moved on to the realm of history. One saw the quarrel between Romulus and Remus, Numa Pompilius and the nymph Igria, Caesar's murder by Brutus, and the other conspirators, of which each, sharply characterized, lunged toward the emperor. From the Greek history, Hector's farewell to Andromache came on the stage, then Perseus and Andromeda, the battle for the Golden Fleece, and Medea's infanticide. The performance had already lasted 2 hours without interruption, when Kuhnel announced that he would now follow with the tragic story of Hero and Leander. The shadows of the two lovers stood sharply on the stage. Tentatively, Leander first approached the maiden. He backed away and disappeared. But then he came again, over the sea, went ashore, and Hero left her tower and hurried to meet him. There the two found themselves in a passionate kiss. The bodies approached each other, seemed to merge, and nevertheless each kept its form. The shadows seemed to be animated by real life, driven by powerful passions, carried away by an irresistible storm. Here, in miniature, through the poor means of a shadow play, an image of heavy reality was given. Life pleased itself in evoking in small black figures an inkling of its power. "Superb, really quite superb," said the Baron. "It is amazing what the fellow can do, and it is not at all funny, although it could so easily become funny." Suddenly Sophie rose, without saying a word, and went out. The Baron sat in silence for a while in astonishment, and then turned to Kuhnel. He had come out from behind a Spanish wall, and was standing by the table with the candles, his eyes fixed on the door through which the woman had passed. "Thunderation," said the Baron at last, picking himself up with difficulty and limping out of the room. He found his wife in the palm room, sitting in the dark, her hands in her lap. And when the Baron reached for them, he found that they were holding the embroidery work, as if the woman, unconscious of the darkness, had wanted to begin embroidering. "What's the matter with you?" he asked anxiously, placing his walking stick against the wall and stroking her hair with his other hand. "Nothing, nothing at all." The words were meek, as if they had difficulty penetrating the darkness. "I think something is wrong. Please tell me. Are you unhappy? I beg you to speak. You don't like the stories of these people? They upset you? I will dismiss him at once." But when the Baron tried to get up from his bent posture, Sophie grabbed his arm and held him tightly. "No," she said. "The poor devil. He has nothing to do with it. He and his shadow art. I find them more amusing than I expected. After all, he came to it quite innocently. It was only a momentary weakness, a malaise. And now it's over. It's completely over. Let's not talk about it anymore. I am completely all right. The man can't help it. He's an artist in his own way." "Yes, he is an artist," said the Baron more reassuredly. "He may justly be seen before high and very high lords." He felt how Sophie's hand slowly slid along his arm, and finally stayed on his hand to rest, as if flattered, and with an unaccustomed caress. This happened so rarely that it made him all soft and moved. He wanted to do something dear to his wife. He wanted to prove to her that he was grateful for her tenderness. "Shall I tell the fellow to stay here a few more days?" he asked. He could think of nothing better at the moment. Sophie made no reply. The Baron stroked her hair again, as if to encourage her to answer. "Yes," replied the woman, and her breathing became more rapid again. "Tell him that he should stay." The shadow player still stood in the middle of the room at the candle-studded table, his gaze facing the door, just as the Baron had left it. Some of the candles had already burned down to the glass cuffs of the candlesticks, and were licking with restless red tongues for new fuel. One of the dying lights kept flickering greedily at the arm of the shadow player, who had put his hand on the table, but he did not notice the danger that threatened his only robe. "Listen here," said the Baron. "I would like to keep you here for a few more days, if it is all right with you." to not resume your vagabond life right away. The shadow player looked at the Baron, came too close to the flame with an involuntary movement, and pulled back his scorched arm. I wonder if it will please the most high-born gracious lady that I use my weak strength for her amusement. He asked his question very cautiously, as if groping. My wife is quite agreeable to it. There you can be quite without worry. The expression on Kuhnel's face was so completely different at that moment that the Baron almost flinched. There came up suddenly, as if from the depths, with irresistible power, a glow of pride, a silent and cruel exultation, a hard certainty and brutal joy. But immediately this sudden flare-up had disappeared again, and with reverent bowing, the shadow player said, Then I ask your grace to accept my thanks with the assurance that I know how to treasure this high honor. So it happened that Anton Kuhnel stayed in the house of the Baron. His art was inexhaustible, and he always knew how to present something new and interesting. He also proved his special skill in drawing and cutting out silhouettes. Almost every evening his patrons gathered in the room where he gave his performances, and once Kuhnel had made himself at home, he accompanied his performances with a script, which he skillfully knew to adapt to what was being portrayed, so that the Baron and his wife were soon laughing heartily, soon moved to tears. Baron von Litrowski had never had any special understanding for fine arts and literature. His fields were war, agriculture, and chess, so it was not difficult to win his admiration with the unfamiliar, yet clever and witty ideas. At first, he resisted the influence Kuhnel exerted against him, but when the 14 days fixed for Kuhnel's stay came to an end, the Baron said openly to Sophie, I don't know what I'm going to say, but I have almost grown fond of the fellow. It will be hard for me to miss him. He has something winning in his nature, and he is a clever man. Even Sophie, who had been around the world of books more than her husband and possessed a finer judgment, admitted that Kuhnel was an educated and obviously well-read man. This pleased the Baron more than he wanted to admit to himself, and he now came out with the proposal to extend the stay of the shadow player indefinitely. He brings life into the house, and when I am out, you will have someone around you to pass the time. He can give you lessons in drawing, as you have long wished to become proficient in this gentle art. Anton Kuhnel did not object to the Baron's proposal and gratefully accepted all the conditions. It turned out that the now several-time shadow player was a former student who had run away from the university and was wandering the world in a mad rush for freedom. The Baron was so grateful for the miracle that he had managed to capture his and he rose to hire his private secretary, and those for which had long been looking for someone to plead the will of his trust. The shadow player, however, did not let his good fortune relax him, and did not exalt himself, nor showed himself impulsive, so that the Baron felt more and more that he had in this man a reliable servant, and at the same time a friend. A friend, he said, walking up and down the room. A friend, I must call him that, for why should there not be a true friendship between a master and a subordinate like this? Is friendship only bound to the equality of estate? Nay, it is a divine power like love, and finds its way in, like the ladder, without asking for office or rank. Sophie, who was sitting at the window with her embroidery, inclined her head still deeper to her work. when the Baron turned to her questioningly at his last words. "And you yourself," continued the imperial judge, "have you not become much happier, and it seems to me healthier in these weeks?" Yes, this young man spreads warmth around him that one cannot resist. How deeply he understands all the questions of horticulture and agriculture, and his chess play. It is both solid and bold. I think he would have made an excellent commander. If it is true that from these qualities in a game one may conclude the same in earnest, one never knows what he wants, but before one knows it, one is surrounded by him and defeated. Have you not found this yourself? His game is irresistible. Sophie's answer was a while in coming. "Certainly," she said, turning her head and looking out into the garden, where Anton Kuhnel had just come from the terrace holding a large bouquet of blood-red roses that he had cut for the housewife. The Baron was right. Sophie, who had earlier seemed to wither under a ghostly power, blossomed anew. She was able to laugh again. She recovered to a second youth and took a lively part in all things again. If anything could have strengthened Anton Kuhnel's already growing friendship with the Baron, it was this brilliant effect on his wife. The drawing lessons gave Sophie immense pleasure, and Anton Kuhnel also put his art at the service of her needlework. For the sake of his friend and his wife, the Baron also turned his attention to these works and praised the draftsman's designs, which were then executed by Sophie in brightly colored silk on precious fabrics. Even more than before, the Baron felt the need to turn away from the world. He surrendered to social duties only to the extent that his position absolutely demanded it, and agreed with Sophie that it was far better in the close domestic circle, with Anton Kuhnel between them as an imaginative narrator. When they went out to a party they were obliged to attend, or when the guests they sometimes had to invite left, they breathed a sigh of relief, and Kuhnel was always ready, even in the middle of the night, to sit down with them and amuse them with a story or a sample of his skill. But the world, which the Baron thought he could neglect, was paying much more attention to him and his life than he knew. Behind his back a whisper arose at first, then a smile, and finally laughter. There were probably some acquaintances who dared to allude to things that the people in his house thought were true. But the Baron was so perfectly naive that he did not even understand what people meant, and remained impervious to the little teasing jabs. Even the closest acquaintances could not think of proceeding with grave clarity, because one could remember that the otherwise so well-fitted imperial judge was always in the brightest rage when someone wanted to intrude into his affairs with good advice without being called in. And so the Baron was spared from hearing a rumor that was spreading more and more. Of course, the world was satisfied that it could not harm his peace, claiming that the Baron knew about the things that were going on around him and tolerated them silently. After Anton Kuhnel had lived in the house of the Emperor's judge for 2 years, the Baron took him hunting one day. It was a gloomy, foggy autumn day, and Sophie watched the horsemen with an anxious uneasiness as they passed through the courtyard. Once again, Kuhnel turned around, just as he rode through the courtyard gate, to greet the housewife standing on the steps of the courtyard stairs with her hat pulled low. On top of it, the street was covered with thick fog, so that it looked as if he was riding straight into a heavy cloud. It was the last time Sophie saw the housemate alive. A few hours later, his body was brought home on a farm wagon. His body was lying on the straw with a wound in his chest, and the straw on his left side was completely drenched with blood. A stray shot, One did not even know from whose rifle had hit him and killed him instantly. As the wagon slowly pulled into the yard, Sophie ran to the window. She saw the man on the farm wagon, saw the blood-soaked straw, and without uttering a cry collapsed at the window, as if by some magic her body had suddenly lost the support of the bones. So the Baron found her after some searching. He picked her up, called the servants, and with their help carried the still fainting woman into the boudoir, where he carefully laid her on the wide sofa. He himself was deeply shaken. His usually rosy face was ashen, and his hands trembled as if he had suddenly aged 20 years. After half an hour, after the Baron had tried in vain to awaken his wife with all sorts of cloths and essences, she came to. She slowly opened her eyes, and all at once she straightened up from the sofa, with such a look of horror on her face that the Baron was startled. "Yes, it is true," he said slowly. "There is nothing else. He is dead." The doctor, who had been called and had just now come from the dead man to check on the woman, confirmed that Anton Kuhnel was dead. The bullet had passed through his heart. The doctor prescribed a calming potion for the housewife, advised her not to take the matter too seriously, clasped her hand, and left. And Sophie still had not spoken a word. "So young," the Baron began again. "But so young. When it hits, but so young. And the terrible thing is that I don't know if it wasn't my bullet that hit him." With a soft groan, Sophie sank back and fainted for the second time. Deepest grief enveloped the house of the Baron like a gloomy veil. The Baron had lost his friend, and only now in the loss did he realize what this young man had been to him. He affirmed that the dead man had been superior to him in all things, and he silently evoked the memory of the artist and the man. Sophie almost never spoke of Kuhnel, but it could happen that during a meal, when the Baron spoke of his friend, she suddenly got up and went out. Her cheerfulness was gone. Her bloom faded. She was sad and silent like a prisoner. One evening, it was at the at the banquet of the estates on the occasion of the opening of the state parliament, when the Baron was talking with Count Zerotin in memory of the departed friend, the Count said after a short pause, during which he looked attentively into his glass filled with crimson muscatel, "It is perhaps the best solution that could have been." "The best solution? You speak strangely. There was nothing that had to be solved. It was a beautiful time, and now all the joy at home has died." "Well, this friendship, Martin, it is, you will forgive me, my war comrade. You always talk about a friendship between you and the shadow player. It is you, the imperial judge, Baron von Latrowski, colonel of the Lycée regiment and a runaway student, a punished vagabond, a fairground comedian. It didn't really fit in with your position. And then the other I know, that the evil tongues are always ready and that there is no truth in it, but nevertheless, with an honest evil will, it could give the impression." It was of little use to the Count that he had invoked his war comradeship with the Baron. With a serious face, the Emperor stood up and asked the Count to follow him into an adjoining room. Here he demanded an explanation from him, and the Count, who was angry because the Baron was still showing his naivety, told him frankly everything that people were saying. "I will give you all an answer," said the Baron, and ordered his sedan chair to be brought to the gate. "I must give them an answer," he kept muttering to himself. And very soon the next morning he came into the bedroom of his wife, who was lying in the pillows, exhausted from a sleepless night, dull and pale. With careful words, He repeated what the Count had told him yesterday, but as carefully and tenderly as he spoke, the pale woman in bed burst into wild convulsive weeping that made her emaciated body tremble. The Baron hobbled desperately up and down the room, and when he no longer knew how to calm the woman, he began to hurl one thunderbolt after another at the loose mouth with the most pithy soldier's curses. I will give them my answer. They should see that their vicious speeches do not reach us, and that we are above all bluster and drivel. And after some reflection, the Baron had found the answer. He combined the most beautiful silhouettes that Kuhnel had cut into a tableau, gave his drawings and paintings precious frames, and hung everything up in the palm room, which was thus transformed into a small museum. In the narrow part of the garden, under a wide-branched linden tree, there was a small hill, and there was the favorite place of the dead man. He had spent many an hour there with Sophie, chatting and drawing. This place was now designated for the memorial of the deceased. There was a silhouette of Kuhnel among the souvenirs that had remained for the Lord. Sophie had drawn it according to her teacher's instructions, and the artist had received the master's full approval. The silhouette really showed the characteristic of Kuhnel's head, the straight nose, the high, clear forehead, the full mouth, and the powerful protruding chin. The Baron had the silhouette transferred to a strong board of precious wood, colored like ivory, and erected this monument on the little hill under the broad-branched linden tree. Kuhnel's head was turned towards the pavilion. He looked into it boldly and a little smiling, with his slender neck rising from the open collar of his shirt. The winter had passed, and when the almost summery warm spring evenings allowed us to stay outside, the Baron invited all his acquaintances to a big garden party. They were amazed to see the museum in the palm room and the monument in the garden, and the Baron did not hesitate to assure each and every one of them that he would not be sorry to do more for the memory of his dear friend. He was very stressed that evening because the duties of the innkeeper were on him alone. Sophie had not been able to appear. She had become weaker and weaker, and had been lying in bed in the city apartment for 2 weeks. When Count Zerotin left the pavilion among the last visitors, the Baron held him back on the threshold of the palm room and pointed to the pictures hanging on the wall. "This is my answer, Andreas," he said. The Count shrugged his shoulders and left. All the rooms of the pavilion were open to the guests. Only one room was closed to them. The room in which Anton Kuhnel had performed his shadow plays had been kept locked since the death at the request of the Baroness. Everything was still exactly as Kuhnel had left it that last evening. The cloth was stretched across the room, the candles on the table. But the curtains were down, the tall door in white and gold was blocked. The room was silent and dead, like the man whose art had unfolded in this room. The Baron stood at the door to this room and looked through the rows of columns. Servants glided back and forth like shadows without a murmur, and from the small dining room came the fine clink of china and the bright sound of silver. Now that the guests had gone, he first felt his tiredness, which he had hitherto known how to resist. So many hours of straining all the powers of his body and mind, always on the lookout to meet a sharp word, a spiteful insinuation, lay behind him. It had been a battle that he had had to fight alone against all. Wouldn't they smile and laugh at him now on the way home? And, terrible thought, whether they had not in the end a right to laugh at him. whether he was not really a trusting fool, doubly ridiculous in his efforts to prove to the entire world that he had no doubts about his wife and his friend. He felt that he was doing wrong by this thought, and he felt at the same time that he must not stay alone, because otherwise these thoughts would surely come back. He was about to leave when he stopped after the first movement. It was as if he had heard a noise behind the door where he had been standing until now, like footsteps across the room, and then the moving of the table, just as Kuhnel had moved his table before the performance began. Was someone in the room? The Baron grasped the handle and pressed it down. The door was locked. There was no one in there. It was impossible that anyone was in the room, so he must have been mistaken. When the Baron came to this conclusion and laughingly prepared to leave for the second time, he was suddenly overcome by a terrible fear from an abyss beyond all logic, quite unexpectedly, so that the Baron did not even know how it had come. It was a feeling of uneasiness, but increased to horror. He was no longer master of this house, over himself and his fate. Someone else had taken all the power out of his hands and pushed him aside by grabbing him by the neck and throttling him until his breath ran out. With a cry, the Baron freed himself from this unbearable feeling and called a servant to him, on whom he leaned to help him to his sedan chair. He spent a restless night, filled with agonizing dreams. In the morning, his wife asked him to come to her. The Baron thought that she looked very bad, and Sophie did not hide from him that she had also had a bad night. "And how was the feast?" she asked. "What did the guests say?" "Say? They didn't dare to say anything, but I don't know what they thought." At this, the Baron kept his gaze fixed on the woman's face. What was the cause of this mysterious illness by which Sophie was consumed? How blossoming and fresh she had been when Anton Kuhnel had lived, and strange that the decline had occurred at the same time as the death of the shadow player. As the Baron continued to dwell on these thoughts, Sophie straightened up a bit in bed. "Excuse me. I have a request," she said. "I don't feel comfortable here in the city apartment. After all, it's so nice out now. I would like to look into the green. Let me be taken back to the pavilion." "Don't ask me to do that. You're not strong enough to be taken. It will hurt you." The Baron talked almost fearfully to his wife. The uneasy feeling that had overtaken him last night came back and took away his prudence. "I beg you to fulfill my wish. Do you think I could get well here when I am always longing for our garden? You should see how good it will do me." "The doctors are against it after all, and they're right, dear, I fear. The memory that dominates the pavilion upsets you too much. You'll only get sicker." Then the Baron saw tears in the eyes of the sick woman, and now it was impossible for him to resist her wishes any longer. He was ashamed of his doubts and treacherous thoughts. He found them abominable and low, and in the desire to right a wrong, he took Sophie's hand and kissed her. The doctors were very unhappy that Sophie was brought to the estate, but finally they had to agree, although they did not hide the fact that in their opinion the stay there could not be beneficial for the patient. The distrust of the Baron, however, suspected hidden insinuations behind the resistance of the doctors. He believed to hear the spirit of the people in the simple and worried speeches, and now he insisted that his wife's will be done. When he saw how happy she was, he was glad and began to hope again that perhaps, against the conviction of the doctors, natural instinct would prevail. But Sophie's condition remained the same. She may have been somewhat more cheerful in her weakness, but at the same time her nature was dominated by a renunciation, as if she had given up trying to defend herself against an inevitable fate. In spite of all his love and care, the Baron could not bear to be with the sick woman often and for a long time. This laughing resignation, this hard, blurred look of the blue eyes made him sick, and there was something else that drove him out of the house. Since the Baron had transformed the pavilion into a temple of memory to the shadow player, it was as if a strange, mocking spirit had taken possession of the once so secret rooms. The Baron never felt quite at ease, even on the days when Sophie found herself willing to play a game of chess with him. There was no longer any real pleasure. The shadow that Sophie's emaciated hand cast over the bedspread and the chessboard with every move frightened him. He had not wanted to admit it to himself for a long time, but at last he could not lie to himself any longer. It was like this. He was afraid of the shadows. In the evening, when he was still walking along the park paths in the moonlight and his shadow jumped in front of him when he turned around a bush, he was frightened and immediately turned around again. He could not bear to see his shadow running in front of him and preferred to return to the darkness. But when he discovered that this uneasiness was connected in some mysterious way, in deeper zones, with the loud talk of the people, he was determined to get rid of it. And he went to the park in the moonlight nights and stood in front of the monument of his friend to immerse himself in a devotional memory. He stayed in the palm room, where he looked at the individual pieces of the museum. But after such an exercise of his willpower, he was always doubly glad to leave the pavilion and the garden. "You are neglecting me, my friend," Sophie said when he entered the sick room one evening. And laughing, she continued, "I am a bad companion for you." The Baron pulled back the curtain and sat down on the chair next to the sick woman's bed. At that moment, he felt as if a shadow was slowly getting up from the chair. A tall, lean, and transparent shadow. The Baron was startled, but at the same moment he composed himself. He could not let the sick woman know of his irritability. He would never at any time refer to the fact that he had been a soldier in the past. With an apology and a complaint about the amount of work he had to do right now, he sat down beside the bed, and Sophie listened to him in silence for a while. Then taking his hand, she said, "Do you want to make me happy?" "Certainly, how gladly. I feel so good today. Accompany me to the palm room. There the view of the park is most pleasant. But you're not supposed to leave the bed. You're so weak, and the night air will harm you. No, no, we'll close the windows. Give me the pleasure." After some coaxing, Sophie managed to persuade the Baron to take her to the palm room. He carefully wrapped her in warm blankets and hobbled along beside her with his arm around her shoulder. Then he moved one of the floral-covered damask armchairs to the large glass table and prepared a seat for his wife. Sophie sat there and gazed out at the garden, while the gentleman entertained her by recounting all sorts of little incidents of the day. It was already quite late, and the servants, when they asked for the orders of the Lord, were sent to bed. The Baron might have taken an hour to bring his spouse into a conversation, when suddenly he interrupted himself. It was as if he had heard a noise in the locked room next door, like footsteps at that time, and then the sound of the table being moved. His arm fell as if paralyzed on the back of the armchair. What was that again? He bent over to look his spouse in the face. She kept her head bent forward, as if listening, and a serene happiness lay in the clear gaze of her eyes, averted from all earthly things. Never had the Baron seen her thus. "Did you hear it?" he asked hoarsely and hastily, touching her shoulder. Slowly the woman turned to him. "Hear? Hear what?" "In there, in that room." Sophie shook her head, and the glow of happiness disappeared from her face, and she let the Baron quickly wrap her in a blanket and lead her back to her room. When he had put her to bed, he left the house and spent the whole night in a circle of aristocrats that used to gather at the state capitol to play and drink. For a few days he only came to the pavilion for a short time, inquired about the condition of his wife, and left the sick room after a small attempt to start a harmless conversation. People in the city were more than a little surprised that the emperor's judge found the time and inclination to spend time in the society in which he was otherwise so seldom seen, especially now during his wife's illness. More acute observers, however, noticed the hurried gaiety that characterized the Baron's character. Simultaneously with this appearance came the news that his wife's health had deteriorated considerably, and the warmest sympathy was shown to the man who, according to general opinion, only wanted to deaden his despair. About a week after the evening in the palm room, the attendant who was on duty at Sophie's bed came to meet the Baron on the threshold of the sick room. She put her fingers to her mouth and asked the Baron to be careful, because the woman, who had spent a bad night, now seemed to be slumbering. Cautiously, the Baron approached the bed and was about to remove the curtain, when the folds were thrown back, even before he had touched them. It was as if a shadow stepped out and slipped past him. A gaunt shadow, but no longer as vague as the first time, but firmer and harder in outline. The shadow floated past the Baron and disappeared into the deep twilight of the background. At the first moment, the Baron had stretched out his hand to the apparition. Now he stood horrified and stared into the darkness of the room, where the glimmer of the night light could not penetrate. Only after a while did he dare to pull back the curtain. There lay the woman in her bed, with a happy smile on her face. She had closed her eyes and seemed to be asleep. Slowly, the Baron let the curtain slip from his hand and quietly left the room. That night he did not seek out the company of his peers, but spent it in a tavern with all sorts of traveling folk, who had just arrived in town at fair time, and whom he incited to the wildest and most boisterous merriment by generous donations. As morning approached, one of the travelers, a knife swallower and magician, regretted that the festival would now come to an end, but the Baron banged his fist on the table and shouted, "Why should this feast be over? There is no way we will get together again so young. That's why we want to stay together until the day comes to an end." All the fair people cheered and celebrated the patron with all kinds of displays and noise, and the Baron sat among them and drank and partied until he thought he had overcome the paralyzing feeling of horror. It was late in the evening when, swaying a little, he rose from the midst of his drinking companions. A murmur of regret went through the people, who had become drunk and sober a few times during the day. "You still want to stay with me?" asked the Baron. "Yes, yes," they all shouted from all sides. "Well then, forward, everyone come along." A tremendous commotion arose, and two prize wrestlers lifted the Baron on their arms and carried him around amid the shouting of others. Then they all moved out, the Baron in front, accompanied by the owner of a puppet theater on the left and a snake lady on the right. The few people who were still on the streets at that time saw, with no small astonishment, that the emperor's judge was at the head of a procession of circus people. At first, amidst laughter and singing, the procession moved quickly forward, but the closer the baron came to his garden, the more he slowed down his pace. Brought to himself by the cool night air, he began to deliberate, pretending, in order to gain time, so that he was not making much progress. It was impossible to take this whole roaring horde into his house. He had to try to cope alone with the fear which began to increase the closer he came to his goal. And it was now time to get rid of the crowd of his companions in a good manner. When he reached the perimeter wall of his park, he turned around and shouted to the whole gang, "Children, I can't do it. I can't take you with me. With my wife's illness, it is not acceptable for me to bring such noisy company into her house. But tomorrow." But the travelers would not hear of it. The baron had dragged them out of the city, and now they should turn back. And when the baron explained once again that they had to go home, they began to grumble and surrounded the patron in an almost threatening manner. But then the baron leaned against the wall of his park and shouted, "Now you will immediately obey the order, riffraff. Otherwise I'll break all your heads in two." And threateningly he raised his walking stick in his right fist. They did not dare to contradict him any further, backed away from him, and finally slunk away like dogs threatened with the throwing of a stone. Breathing a sigh of relief, the baron continued on his way. But his companions had hardly left him when he was again seized by the uneasiness and anxiety that always seemed to await him here. He stopped and was about to call out to those who had been driven away to return. Then he wondered whether it would not be better to turn back and spend the night in his townhouse. But now he remembered his duty. He had not inquired about his wife's condition for an entire day. Although he was aware of the seriousness of her condition, it was at least necessary to get news of her condition, and then he could leave the pavilion again. And so he hobbled along the park wall towards the entrance. Suddenly he was startled. The moon had come out from behind a cloud and cast a barren shadow on the whitewashed wall. The silhouette was sharp, as if conjured by the hand of Kuhnel, and the sudden memory of the dead man made the baron stop with a jerk. Then he continued on his way all the faster, keeping his head turned away from the wall, so as not to see his silent companion. From the gatekeeper, the baron learned that his wife had been unconscious for most of the day, and it was obvious to the old man that he had given up hope of seeing his mistress alive. Quietly the baron entered the palm room and was about to go into the adjoining room, through which one came to the sick room, when he heard a light step coming towards him. He stepped back, and at that moment a man passed in front of him, shadowy but of a distinct shape. And when the baron took a close look at him, he thought he recognized the face and posture of Anton Kuhnel. The man walked across the palm room towards the closed door of the sacred room, opened it, and entered. There came a desperate courage over the baron, which was stronger than his horror. He rushed to the door and tore at the handle. The door was locked. Groaning, the baron gave up in his effort and limped as fast as he could out into the garden. He was crazy. He was undoubtedly mad, and pursued by his horror, he ran around in the garden senselessly, without knowing what he was fleeing from and to where. Suddenly, something held him. Some perception bored into him, penetrated him like a glowing iron, and finally reached his consciousness. He got control of himself again and saw that he was standing in front of the monument of the shadow player. The moon was already so high that it fully illuminated the little hedgehog and the board. But The Baron stood frozen. It was as if some force was pulling off his scalp. The board was smooth and empty. The silhouette of Kuhnel was gone. With clenched teeth, the Baron turned away. He walked up the main path of the park toward the pavilion and needed all his willpower not to scream in horror. A glow of light came to him from among the trees there, and the Baron was astonished, for the house had been silent and gloomy when he had left it. As he approached, he saw that the glow came from the locked room, and in a desperate determination to savor all the horror that this night had in store for him, he crept over to the terrace in front of the lighted windows. The curtains were down as usual, and inside it were bright enough to cast a strange shadow play on the screen. And there it emerged from the memory of the Baron. It was the play of Hero and Leander, as Kuhnel had performed it on the very first evening. Only the shadows filled the entire window frame. The bodies pressed against each other and united in a wild kiss. Swept away by powerful passions, by an irresistible storm, the two lovers found themselves in a frenzied embrace, and the Baron recognized both. It was his wife and the shadow player. Then the Baron climbed up the stairs and tore at the closed door. It opened and he saw the entire room. Sophie was all alone. She stood in the middle of the room, in the robe in which she lay in bed, motionless, and her eyes closed. On Kuhnel's table, all the candles were burning. The Baron ran up to the woman and grabbed her shoulder. "So you have betrayed me, he shouted. Sophie made no reply, opened her eyes a little, and then fell heavily against his chest. Frightened, he embraced her and brought her slowly, half carried, half guided, to her room. The waitress was asleep in her armchair and awoke only when the Baron had already brought the woman into bed. The Baron took one more look at Sophie's face, a fine, withered face, but one with a happy smile. Then he went out. He went into his room, where he had decorated an entire wall with weapons. Slowly he took down a riding pistol and loaded it carefully. He didn't know what he was doing it for, or why he was going out into the park with the loaded pistol. Something drove him and guided him. And then, all of a sudden, he was standing in front of Anton Kuhnel's monument again. There was the silhouette once more on the board. It was clearly there again, had returned. And the Baron felt a smile on his lips like an evil compulsion. Slowly, with a sure hand, he raised the pistol and aimed it at the silhouette's chest. "You shall not leave here, my friend," he whispered. "Never again." The shot cracked, and the Baron approached the monument like any other target to examine it. He had hit it well. The bullet sailed straight to where the heart of the living man had been. When the Baron returned to the sick room, the waitress stood bent over Sophie's bed. When he entered, she rose and said softly, "She is dead." The Baron sold his properties in the city, resigned from his office, and retired to his old estate. But he no longer enjoyed farming and did not want to know anything about chess. His mind was in a state of disarray, and after a short time his strength began to deteriorate. In the park of the Baron, which the state parliament had purchased, they tried to establish a beekeeping colony, but the bees had no desire to thrive. End of story. That was a long one, but it's a pretty cool story. Till next week. Thank you.